Hi, Misha here, and I know that little pocket 32s, even the larger ones like this here, aren't the most sexy and interesting guns, but bear with me. This one has John Browning attached to it, Fabrique Nationale, World War II, and even Nazi Germany. So I think it has something to kind of talk about here. This is a World War II production FN Model 1922, also known as the Model 1910/22. This is considered a military and police type gun by FN, and it was originally custom built for the young nation of Yugoslavia. And so in this video, I thought we would talk about the gun itself, a couple of its influences, and one of the guns it actually influenced itself. So with that, we'll get into it. Before we get started, I'll ask please like, share, and subscribe. I know, again, that little 32 caliber military pistols might not be everyone's cup of tea, but hey, come on, what else do you have better to do? Hang out with me for a bit. You might find you enjoy it. And if you do, if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. And with that, let's get into the FN 1922. Let's begin with the FN Model 1903, or rather the Swedish Husqvarna Model 1907. John Browning, of course, is famous for so many things, including his really development of the 32 ACP and the 380 cartridges and making designs for them. The Model 1900, and then we get into the Model 1903 here. Now in America we had two versions. The American Browning guns were made by Colt. They would usually buy his designs. He had the 1903 pocket hammerless. That was a smaller gun than this, and it was routinely chambered for 32, later 380. In Europe, Browning designs were manufactured by Belgium. They had the right to his name, all that good stuff. And they scaled up his earlier designs to make the 1903 here, chambered for 9x20 semi-rimmed. At the time, a very powerful cartridge for a direct blowback gun. Notice it has a automatic last round hold open, no release, but you just do that to go forward. 7-shot mag. Typical internal hammer system. A little small hammer back here that's concealed. Grip safety, pretty Browning feature. Lanyard loop. And of course we have our manual safety here, which I need to, again, cock to show you. And again, move the bag out. Yeah, releases are nice sometimes. We have our safety there. So we have two safeties. Not yet a grip safety, worth noting. Now this gun, like I said, it has a small internal hammer. It also has the, I'm going to point the gun at you. It has the recoil spring housed in a guide rod under the barrel. Not too dissimilar to the 1911 we would see later. Now this was produced in large numbers by Sweden, and FN would make it up through the 1920s. Now during World War I, we had this, the Ruby. Very much like either the Colt 1903 or a scaled down FN if you prefer. This is a not licensed Spanish copy of the Browning design. It's a little bit smaller, single piece slide, very chunky frame. We have a heel mounted mag release, and we have a 9-round mag in 7.65 32. It's important later. The only real safety we have is right here. That's it. Still concealed hammer, no grip safety in the back, and no magazine disconnect safety. These were, let's say, primitive guns. Some were very good, some were quite bad. They were simple and cheap to produce, and that's why nearly 750,000 were sold to France during the war. They were also used by Italy, Yugoslavia, many others, at least in some small amount. So this was a simplified 1903 type. But one thing to point, he introduced a full-size grip and kind of more of a military style, even if crude. So the Great War showed that simple blowback guns, be they in 9x20, 32, or even 380, were viable for self-defense. Also cost-effective, and their simple construction meant that they were less prone to dust and dirt and mud and grime. Now, the 1910, which I don't have one here to show you, was Browning's next step forward. It replaced the internal hammer with a striker firing system, which Browning had used before, and it had a new way of mounting the recoil spring that would be around the barrel as opposed to under it. This allowed for a slimmer slide frame, and it gave some manufacturing advantages too. The 1910, not surprisingly, was introduced in 1910, and it was manufactured by FN Herstal in Belgium. Colt was offered this new design for the U.S. market, but declined, so the 1910 was only made in Europe. And it was introduced really for the commercial market, but they were happy for any military or police sales they might acquire. It had about a 3.5-inch barrel, and it was about 5 inches long, and it had either a 6-round capacity in 380 or a 7-round capacity in 32. 6 plus 1, 7 plus 1. So it's a simple striker-fired blowback gun, and it did introduce a very good safety system. It had the grip safety again. The 1910 also had the manual safety back here, and it had a new magazine disconnect safety. So if the mag was out, you can't fire the pistol. While it was mostly bought by civilians, commercial market, and some police, especially as a backup gun, the first military user was Serbia, who purchased a couple of hundred in 1913. And this is kind of how it led to being very infamous in 1914 when the 1910 was used to assassinate the Archduke, beginning World War I, making it quite possibly the most indirectly bloody pistol in history. The 1910 would serve throughout World War I and afterwards. It was quite a success for FN, and they would keep making it, at least in certain versions, for years and decades to come. So that gives you a kind of a wrap-up, and now we move forward here. In 1923, the young nation of Yugoslavia asked FN, basically held trials, and said they wanted a gun with about a 4.5-inch barrel, 8-shot capacity, and since they already had some 1910s, FN just basically took the 1910 design, extended the grip down, increasing its capacity in 380 from 6 to 8 rounds, and its capacity in 32 from 7 to 9. They also extended the barrel to 4.5 inches, making the gun just a hair under 6 inches total. And it's kind of interesting because they actually made an extension for the existing slide. That's why this little catch is up front here, as opposed to going to just a longer solid slide. Walther would do something similar between their models 3 and 4. And that's how the more service-oriented Model 1910-22, or just Model 1922, came to be. Now, Yugoslavia preferred them in 380 or 9mm Kurz, or 9mm skirt, or 9mm Corto if you're in Italy. Yeah, lots of names, 9x17 Browning. And they would order 60,000. So that was the first major contract for this enlarged version. And whereas FN had considered the 1910 a commercial gun, they really considered the 22 to be a military police gun. It wasn't something they were really pushing on any civilian market. And they would get other contracts and other orders throughout the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s, while the world was still awash with a lot of 32s from World War I. This was a cheap, effective gun. The larger grip, the 9+1 capacity in 32, the 4.5-inch barrel, and Browning's updated recoil and striker system, and the overall safety of the gun made it very popular, and it was used by a myriad of nations. The Netherlands, Greece, Romania would order some. Finland, who had also issued the Ruby, would order some, and so on and so forth. But as you know, Belgium, just as it had happened in World War I, was overrun by the Germans in World War II. And that's where our pistol today comes from. Beginning in 1940, the Germans would order FN to produce various guns for them, including the high power and the 1922. We'll say under contract, but really it was under occupation. And it kind of gets interesting from a collecting point of view. The Nazis would adopt both the 380 and 32 cal versions. They would call the 32 the P626B, and the 380 the P641B. B for Belgium, of course. And it was the 32, of course, they really focused on. But they would have some 380s, usually built from existing parts or captured from other contracts. The first Waffen-amped guns would be in 1940, and they would use the code 613, or the inspector code, I should say, 613. These would basically be built from pre-war parts or even captured contract guns, so had nice Bakelite grips, and they had really nice machining, polish, bluing, basically commercial standards. In 1941, a new code would be assigned to the inspector. It would be 103. And use of the black grips would continue, and fit and finish was still quite nice. Now this one here has the code 140, which started to appear in late 1941 and would be used throughout the remainder of the duration. The Nazis would continue to occupy the FN factory until September of 1944. In 1942, they would introduce these checkered wood grips. They would also introduce simplified bluing and kind of cut back on the polishing and machining steps, all really to kind of fit the war. The majority, there are about 400,000, give or take, of these made for the Germans. Over 300,000 were of this third variation. And what they wanted them for was the Luftwaffe. This was essentially a standard issue gun for them. Being in 32, it was well suited for pilots. With a 9+1 capacity, 4.5-inch barrel, it was enough. It was also small enough and light enough for a defensive gun. Another gun that the Luftwaffe used, I just brought it out for a second, is the Fimaru here, 37M. Now this was from Hungary, from FEG, and it was known as the Pistol 37. And it got a little more, shall we say, respect, because at the time Hungary was more of an ally with Nazi Germany than an occupied nation like Belgium. And they would get about 85,000 of these for the Luftwaffe too, but they never really could produce enough, and so that's why the FN stepped in, because it was a gun that could be produced and had the Browning reputation. So yeah, let's kind of get more into the mechanics of it. Alright, these both disassemble very similarly, at least to some extent. Let's start with the ruby, the hammer fired here. As this way with the twisty turny barrel. Comes right out. Wonderful machining, huh? And from there, just push this down and force it forward. And you have your recoil spring under here. And that actually helps hold in the catch and everything. Pretty simple. Of course, this is a simplified Browning. Anyway, the 1922 is a little bit more complicated. So we have this spring-loaded catch in the front. We push it forward. It is pretty small. And that kind of comes off like a little lug here. And then we have our spring. If I can get this one out. This one's stiff. Well, maybe. We'll try without it. Let's take our mag out. Hold it back. We can rotate our barrel. Then we let go forward and it comes off. And we have our frame here. Obviously the spring is around our barrel. They essentially come out the same, but obviously totally different spring setup. Slides are very similar. The difference though would be with the firing system. This is for the striker. And this has a itty bitty little hammer in there. And of course our striker is in our slide here. There are pros and cons to both hammer and striker fired. So yeah, a little more complicated, mostly because of this whole lug thing here. It's neat, but I suspect they did it so they could use the same forging for both types and just change it up a little bit as needed. Alright, with that, let's get them back together. And back together. But we still can't pull the trigger because, again, that magazine disconnect safety. There we go. You know, I'll be honest, the way John Browning designed guns is, of course, legendary. But I can tell you this, he was a very, very visual person. His guns do not come apart for me instinctually. Not like others. There are some guns that just come apart in my hands. All of his guns from the 1900, the 1903, the 1922, the 1911, they require a lot more thought from me than, say, I don't know, quite a few military guns, frankly. So I brought one more out to show. The French MAB Model D. Very much inspired by and almost a direct copy of the 1922. Of course, the French had the Ruby, and they had some FNs as well. And in 1933, they introduced the Model C, quickly followed by the enlarged Model D here. This has the same basic operating system. It is also striker fired. And it has the, I'm going to point this at you, recoil spring around the barrel. It even has a somewhat similar takedown mechanism, at least in the Type 1 up here, like the FN, although it is a full-length slide on the Model D. Has a grip safety, all that good stuff. And this gun would actually be built up until 1980. You can tell it does have some elements of the Ruby, like the safety here. At least somewhere location. So the 22 definitely influenced a lot of guns. Virtually at the same time that the Nazis left the FN factory, the Allies took over and FN began manufacturing guns for Belgium again. And the Belgian police were very quick to adopt the 1922. The first production guns in the A block would be built with parts originally manufactured under the Nazi occupation, so there might be some leftover markings in Waffen-Amps. And then, of course, they'd make all new guns. And they would continue to produce the 1922 through the 1950s and into the 60s. And as I said at the beginning, Colt opted not to build this in the USA. So in 1955, Browning Arms Corporation in the US, which was an import company, brought over the FN model 1955, which was a slightly updated, newer grips and things, 1910. And then after the 1968 Gun Control Act, which put a point system in place for guns, FN would introduce the Model 71, which was essentially a sporterized version of a 22 here. It had the longer barrel, but it also, for the first time, had a single piece slide. It didn't have the kind of extension piece, which makes perfect sense to me why they'd go to a single piece. They also added target sights, again for points. Also for points, they added a thumb rest grip. And they even gave a pinky rest magazine to the 71 model. And these would come over up until the 1980s. So the 1922, even though it was originally made for Yugoslavia, who was inspired by the Ruby and the 1910, it really carried on. And of course in France, the MAB, which is honestly a truly close copy, these would continue in production and would be used by the Bank of France, some by the military, and of course these would be produced under forced occupation by the Nazis too. Could do a whole video on just like Nazi produced guns. And for that matter, just to bring it out one more time, the larger Swedish M07, while it was first replaced by the M40 Lottie in Sweden, when the Lottie started to have troubles in the 80s, they brought these good old guns back out of storage and used them until they had enough Glocks. So, very long history in Sweden too. And that's what these are. These are simple blowback guns, and they are durable, relatively inexpensive to manufacture. And hey, a total of 10 rounds in 32 or 9 in 380 is adequate for self-defense. So that's why they saw a lot of military use and some police use. The Finnish used them against the Russians in the winter and continuation wars. They got about. They really did. This is a gun that a friend has had for a while, and I told him if he ever wanted to sell it, hit me up. I was interested, and last weekend he ostensibly brought it over to show me. And then as we were wrapping up our deal, he asked if I was really interested, and I said sure. And he decided he needed other things more, And so now it's with me. I'll probably set it next to that Femoru that you saw earlier. I know, like I said at the beginning, that these aren't the sexiest pistols around, but I like them. They're interesting, and compared to other Nazi-marked guns, they're very affordable too. So, what do you own? I know that there are plenty of others out there, French guns, Czech guns, all kinds of things got Waffen amps. So I'd love to hear about your own little personal collections. With that, I appreciate you tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe, all that good stuff. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon, next time.